Colette Wabnitz, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you very much for the interest.
Tell me, first of all, what prompted this study into who owns all these DNA patents?
Well, it was basically, the study was led by the research group in Stockholm. And so when we started these discussions, what emerged is that we had somewhat of an idea at times where patents or what countries were associated with certain patents, but we didn't have necessarily an idea of who might be interested in patenting them. And so that's what prompted aspects of the study.
Now, what are the implications of somebody owning a patent on, say, a jellyfish or something?
Well, I think that an important point here to clarify is that they don't necessarily own a patent on the jellyfish entirely. So they might be interested in a particular company, or a university might be interested in a particular aspect of the jellyfish because it produces an enzyme that is of particular interest. And so then there's a particular gene sequence or product from that gene sequence or a modified aspect of that gene sequence that will then be associated with a patent.
So these are people who own the DNA sequencing of these creatures then?
That's correct. So there is an important distinction here to make as well, in that there are some countries that allow as an innovative step, which is critical when you want to patent, to actually use the original sequence with some modifications. But then there's other countries that say no, that is not recognized as an innovation, and so that cannot be filed as a patent. And there was a very famous case about this in the U.S. A few years ago.
But you did find that one particular company owns pretty much half of these DNA sequences, right?
That's correct. So what happens is that, yes, 47% of the patents that were associated with marine genetic sequences were owned by BASF.
Now, again, what are the implications of a private company like that owning these DNA sequences?
Well, the implications are multifold. I think, one, it's interesting to know. It came as a surprise to them as well. They didn't know that they had control over, that wide a range of patents that were associated with genetic sequences. So I think, one, it's of interest. Two, it means that, it could be associated with some complexity, shall we say, because people may say, well, it raises issues of equity, for example. But I think it can also be seen as an incredible source of hope or optimism, particularly when you think of the negotiations that will be taking place later this year for the areas beyond national jurisdictions, where you say, okay, well, normally when you talk about engaging stakeholders, you may have like a multitude of stakeholders to engage. And here you have one company that really knows what they're doing and that have been in this field for a long time and that are willing to invest a lot of money in this field as well. And so you can say, well, we need to bring you to the table so that we can openly discuss with, the members, what are your points of view, what, would be a compromise solution that you would be happy with, what are your perspectives. So I think it opens the door for, a really collaborative and cooperative negotiation table.
But nonetheless, there is a financial aspect to being the holder of this DNA sequencing, right? I mean, there is money potentially to be made from these things if there are scientific development, medicines, for example, to be developed from the sequence.
Absolutely, yes.
So when you have a company like that, could it not represent potentially some kind of conflict for the world in the sense that a company owns all these sequences and theoretically owns the rights to products that may be developed from that to the detriment of a country where they were found or society at large?
Well, I don't necessarily think so. I think that's why it's important to engage with them because, as I said in an earlier question that you raised, there's a lot of money that is needed for research to develop products. I mean, and these products are often to the benefit of society, right? So, for example, new medicines, etc. So the research is perhaps like the financial aspect is not always the greatest motivator, but it gets things done. And it means we have new drugs. And so what is important now is to make sure that there's, yes, equity. So like if the product, for example, to use your jellyfish example, so if we use a sequence that comes from a jellyfish and the jellyfish is a species that occurs only in a particular country, then there is a need to know where it comes from, which is what we're asking for, that there's greater transparency in knowing where the genetic sequences come from, and that there's some equity established in terms of benefit sharing. So that you say, okay, well, we recognize we invested in getting this jellyfish. We invested in extracting the sequence. We invested in, utilizing it in a way that is beneficial for society. And we also recognize that as a consequence of that, if we make a lot of money, we want to make sure that you derive some benefit of it. And this could be in terms of finances. It can also be, in terms of, building capacity or establishing a lab in that particular country, what have you. That is then for those parties to negotiate. And that's what we're asking and, saying, like, at least in the terms of the Nagoya Protocol. So that's where you have a specific country that is involved. But for areas beyond national jurisdiction, which is most of the oceans, there is no country. So who sits at that table? And so that's why we're saying it's important to bring all these different parties at the table so that we can have an agreement that benefits society at large.
So was this kind of a surprise to researchers like yourself who discovered that? And obviously, you're saying that even BASF was surprised at the DNA sequencing that they hold. So was this a surprise to find out that 10 countries hold most of the sequences, and a company like BASF owned half of them?
It was absolutely a surprise, yes.
So how? Go ahead.
No, that's it.
So when you talk about sharing of this now that you have this kind of information, how is that going to help in sharing of potential developments then through things like UNCLOS and so on?
That's a very good question. So I think the information is available. So the database that is associated with the research that we did is available online. And we have started to engage with, the scientific community at large. And we have also been in touch with BASF. And we hope, that BASF will be happy to engage with the respective parties that will be part of these negotiations in the future. And not only BASF. I think it's fair to highlight also that there were, like a particular university that was associated with the commercialization center, YEDA, that has been patenting a lot of genetic sequences. And so all the different institutions that were highlighted, I think, need to be invited to the table to develop an agreement that, still respects the fostering of innovation, but also really highlights equity. And making sure that we have a roadmap for ocean stewardship that is mindful of all these different things.
So in that sense, this research that you've done is an extremely useful tool towards that end of creating equity, because people didn't know this beforehand. Is that right?
Well, we certainly would like for it to be informing the discussions that way. Absolutely.
And is this, now you are attending a major conference on the sea. Has this been a discussion at the conference?
No, it has not, actually. The conference is focusing on climate change and fisheries mostly, but there have been discussions around areas beyond national jurisdiction, and it has come up not specifically relating to genetic sequences or resources, but in terms of species that might in their distributions in the future. So, for example, species that one country exploits in a particular area now might not necessarily be the same type of species that they exploit in the future, because species are moving as a result of climate change. And so, that brings issues in terms of what may happen in the future, what agreements have countries signed, and what to do with areas beyond national jurisdiction.
Colette Wabnitz, thank you very much for this.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.